Hey everybody, my name is Neil Kushwaha, and the other day I was talking about some of my COVID data that I've been collecting and how I've been interpreting it, and I was sharing it with some friends in the US, and one of them actually said I should make a little video to share it so that he can share it among his friends because it was very interesting. So here's a go with that. First, I'm going to walk you through the data sources that I gather, and then how I manipulate it and what I do with it, just to organize the data and do some formulas on it, and then give you some visual outcomes and possibly give you a chance to possibly decide, as if you were a nation state leader, as to how you would decide whether your country should open or not. All right, so let's get this thing started. I'm just going to share off my my screen here with some content, and basically describing to you the website data that I gather here. So this is Johns Hopkins website, which is a pretty simple view here. Most of you've seen it. Collects global data and primarily detail on the U.S. As you can see here, good detail on the U.S. I download their data from GitHub, which is available to anybody in CSV format. And then I also grabbed Canadian data from PHAC, or Public Health Agency Canada, and they have variety of data here on each province and territory, and available for you to browse through here, but also download as a CSV if you choose to, and different content here, but quite a bit of content in their own data that when you download more than that, so you see much more than that. So aside from those two, I also grabbed data from obviously Worldometers, and you can see here they have global data. And the way I do this is I'll select one of these, and I'll just say open in a new tab. Let's say it's Brazil, and I'll go view page source, and jump to the total number of cases. Now it seems to be the Worldometers and even Johns Hopkins data only begins from Feb 15th onward, which is very interesting. I'm going to show you something of that later, and until current. And you can see here Feb 15th, even though there were 0 cases for Brazil, and as it's shown here, it's increasing, and you can see the content here related to those dates. So it gives you that perspective there. Similar to, I guess, just Brazil here again. Should have just pointed to that. France data I get from their website here of the Gouvernement de France here, and you can see their different content here for different regions. You can obviously zoom in and zoom out. I like this interface as well. Tremendous amount of info here as well on situation in France. And then you obviously have Australia data, which you can download as well. The Berliner Post as well. Here you can see a lot of good content from them. Is available, and it's keeping in mind they're not just tracking Germany data, they're tracking global data, which is really fascinating. You know, like I really like that a lot. So their interface is really super clean, and Germany data is obviously in high detail here. So again, you can view different regions as well, the world and Europe, and in quick clicks here. I should have just done that really rapidly. Italian data here, same. If you can read Italian, these are positive cases, these are healed or recovered cases, these are deaths, and these are total cases. And different regions here, you can view by province as well. So Lombardy, Milano, and Lombardia. You see here, different regions here, really neat to see. But you can also download their data from their source, and India's data. And then a few other data as well, but I'm just going to show you some other zones here. I grabbed data from mobility trend reports as well, and it's really interesting to see this data. You can download this data in CSV format, as well as from Apple, and as well from Google. What this is basically the number of requests we have made, we as community of users have made on these two platforms for map data to say, hey, you know, I want to know how to get from location A to location B. It's not tracking you individually, it's just tracking the quantity of requests and categorizing them as driving requests, walking requests for directions, and directional requests for transit. So let's pick on Toronto. And if I look at Toronto really quick here, I see Toronto's baseline is about 0%, the 0% line here, obviously, and it rises up and down and during parts of the month and the days and whatever not as it goes through. So January, February, and the weekends, you see probably drops down or rises up. I'm not exactly sure, but just in this content by viewing at it, it's likely weekdays versus weekends or busy periods and less busy periods. And then all of a sudden you see this drop here in early March. And that gives an indication that Canada took the lockdown quite seriously and just we're staying home, at least in Toronto. And for a few weeks here into April and then into March, people started opening up and started traveling and making requests on their phones to say, hey, I need to know how to get from point A to point B by driving or by walking. And you can see this increase here approaching the baseline, whereas by transit, it's still very low. So people are still nervous to take transit, it seems as though. Let's pick a city in the United States. Pittsburgh, let's just say, been there a few times. So let's take a look at Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, you can see here that a similar idea, baseline there. You can see, and all of a sudden it drops in early March, but it rises up quite rapidly. And their driving and walking is above baseline, whereas transit is still not widely taken as much as it was before. So it's very interesting the number of requests they're getting. They're coming back up to about baseline. So this is a neat little tool to look at, and you can download data from here too. I'll get to some of the other content here really quickly. So let me jump to the screen here where I have some data that I can share with you related to how I store this data and what I do with it. So if I look at this data here, it's an Excel spreadsheet. I've got a lot of tabs in here. I'm going to walk you through some of this content really as briefly as I can. So first of all, I'm only tracking the confirmed cases. I'm not picking on deaths or anything like that. I'm a numbers guy, and I love numbers, mathematics. I track the doublings. I love the exponential growth that's happening live in front of us and exciting. And I've written quite a bit about it on, of all places, Facebook, but I share that as well there. So obviously, this is a record of dates. And everything is in formula. So if I just hit this key here, boom, you can see data is in date format, and then the content here for worldwide is described in numeric form, and then obviously you have all these formulas to figure out other content. So this is delta from the day before, the difference from one day to the next. What's this value, and so on and so forth. And similarly here, this is the doublings. And basically it's a logarithmic scale here, log base 2, and then here the days per doubling, and then after that it jumps to China, Canada. I've got Iran, New Zealand, Estonia, Germany, US, Australia, India, Russia, Brazil, Peru, South Africa, and Pakistan. And I've kept some notes here. If you look at key things, key events that happened, first death outside of Hubei, first death in the Philippines, and so on and so forth. And I've just been tracking this for a long time. What's fascinating is you may recall that I'm going to switch this back to the view here. Remove the formulas. What's fascinating is you may recall that both Johns Hopkins data and as well the data from Worldometers is starting around Feb 15th timeframe. I have data here dating back to December 8th, where the first case happened in China. And I've read some journals and papers and whatnot that have come out of there describing the number of cases and what they've been tracking in China to this date. And that's why these are in red here. I've sourced them from there. And then the 22nd is some data that's coming from what I believe is Hopkins data, and then thereafter it goes to Worldometers and mixes up, and I've got some different sources of data coming through here that I'm essentially amalgamating and mixing from different nations as well. So essentially, if you look at this is my source data that I'm using now in my calculations. Canadian data I bring in directly here. That's why it's all formulas on the previous. You can see Canadian data. I just correct the date field here because it's a mess in Excel. Dates are a mess. But if you look up top here, they have quite a bit of data here of the number of deaths in total, and then per day and percents, and you can get all this data for free for download off of PHAC if you're really interested. And it's separated by region province and territory, as well as by repatriated travelers. In this case here, you can see them separately marked. So you can see, their cases here, 13 cases, very minuscule, and confirmed cases, very minuscule quantity there. and 76 of those of the cases of the repatriated travelers were tested. So you get this idea here. You can see that we tested over 2 million cases, or people, individuals, and out of those we have confirmed number of over 98,000, almost 99,000. And so yeah, PHAC data is pretty good actually. And so I sucked that into my content here, and you can see Canadian data comes down here. So what's really interesting is we're sitting at a double, and I love to digest numbers as it is, and I'll get to the graphical view here so you can get to that too and hopefully digest it in a different way. But globally, we're at the 22nd doubling. So it went from 1 case to 2 case to 4 case, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, so on and so forth. Number of individuals being infected and or tested, actually, not just infected, but confirmed cases. So we're at the 22nd doubling. So you can see here we're approaching almost over 8 million cases, 8.1-ish million cases, and you're going to see here that we're going to hit 23rd doubling when we do that. And I'm tracking that based on a log base too. And then this field here, and this entire field here is tracking the days per doubling. So in order to jump from one day, you see here, we were at 7.29 days per doubling at the 21st, and then here 7.38, and when we switched to 22 days per doubling, globally we went down to 7 days per doubling. So we're sitting at around 8. It's not bad. I mean, I'd like to see us in 11 to 12 range here before we can say that it's pretty near flattened out. But because that's an average, keeping in mind the average days per doubling since day 0 of that scope. So world was December 8th, whereas Canada is essentially January 31st was their first case in Canada here. You can see that if I just jump up to Canada's first case, pardon me, these are all formulas, so it's not jumping well. We had 4 cases on right here, January 31st. Okay, so obviously our delta, when we didn't move up from 4, it was all zeros. Then we jumped up to 7. There was 3 and stayed at 7. So it was slow moving at first, and what seems to be we did pretty good. We're sitting at 16th doubling, and we're at about 8.38 doublings per day. Iran is at 17th doubling and 6.76 doublings per day, days per doubling. Pardon me. I apologize for transversing that. And then we have New Zealand is at the 10th doubling, and they're sitting at 10 to almost 11, which is great. That high value of days per doubling shows that they've really locked down some of that control of the spread, which is really good to see. Much like, say, China sitting at 11, Estonia is sitting at 10. They've shut it down in that sense too. Germany is sitting at 8. It's getting there. It's probably close to shutting down. We want to see a longer trend of no new cases. They're still getting in the hundreds cases here. Keeping in mind it's just based on reporting data, so we're using what we have. U.S. is a pretty serious number here. We're still seeing about 25,000 cases, 25,000 cases per day, and that's pretty nasty. Even though it is based on population, they're still cracking 21 doubling here. They just cracked into 21 doubling, 21st doubling, and they're at almost 7 days per doubling. So they have what I feel like is a long way to go before you can really open the nation up. Might be able to open regions, but definitely not, international travel likely or domestic travel everywhere, Australia and so forth. So if I were to, I'm tracking moving average and convergences and divergences as well, and obviously have some lookup tables for these plots. So I'm going to walk you through some of these plots. If I could just give you an indication here, again, these are all formulas as well. So what I do is I select the data type that I want. And I've created all these things here in myself in Excel. And let's say I want to see the cumulative data, which you can see on almost any website these days. And you want to see Canada because we're Canadian and we see the cumulative cases, increasing cases, obviously not the ones that have healed or recovered or excluding deaths or anything like that. This is just strictly a numerical analysis of confirmed cases. So the cumulative cases you can see kind of looks like it's tapering off, and people look at this, and then the other part that people often look at is the delta or the daily cases, the differential of day by day. So if I'll pick on Canada again, you can see this delta. It's a little bit more jagged, but nevertheless you see this increase, and then it rises and rises, and there's kind of this average, and we're still dropping down. We're still in the 400s, I believe. Yeah, 472 and 409 here. Yeah, so we still have what I feel like I'd like to see us stay in the teens down below. Let's give an example of, let's say, I don't know, let's pick on Estonia. they're in the teens here, 7, maybe a little over 20 here, and you see that they're keeping it pretty low. Obviously, population is low there too in comparison. Let us pick, New Zealand. New Zealand is actually claims they've opened up their country and they're doing a fantastic job in managing that. It's amazing. I'm really proud of that. Proud of them. Sorry. What seems like they rose really high, but keep in mind there's only 140 cases in one day, so they've technically handled this entire process really, really well. Comparatively, if I were to just pull up another nation here, let's just say Canada, to New Zealand, New Zealand's a blip in comparison to how many cases Canada has had. And again, I'm not doing it per capita in this case here in this view, just to give you a perspective of something. But let's compare it to possibly their neighbors, Australia. And you can see, even compared to Australia, New Zealand has handled it has suffered a very small number of cases and have literally plateaued down to the 0 mark, whereas Australia still has some work to do there. They're actually they're in their teens as well, and like I think we said earlier, I mean they have a good chance of opening up too. So I think that's pretty exciting. So aside from the Delta, I'm going to show you something else, and that's the doubling rate. Most people don't look at this, and this is a fascinating part to me if you like exponential growth. And I say this often, is if you realize that you're in a mode of exponential growth, it's probably too late to do anything. You should have done the time to react as before you realize you're in the exponential growth range here. So here you can see that Canada was quite slow on our first and second doubling, and it's pretty easy to quarantine and lock down, let's say, a small group of people who are infected, 1 or 2, and then as your testing increases and whatnot, we saw this mass growth. And then now, keeping in mind, we're in the 16th doubling, so the numbers are huge, and 64,000 going to 128,000, or 64K to 128K. You're looking at it's greater. It's harder and harder to get to that next point because the numbers are doubling, right? So it takes a bit of time, but we're also behaving a little better, and we have been behaving better actually. I'm not sure if we're continuing to, but it's good to see in Canada. I'll show you another view later on, but let's compare that to, say, China, and you can see China sitting at the 16, doubling for a very long time, which is really good to see. That means they're not really growing, and it's technically their days per doubling as well. And if you compare that to China's delta, just for the sake of looking at it, you can see their daily deltas are negligible. So they've handled it really well, keeping in mind a country of 1.4 billion people, right? So it's pretty amazing. Now, I get often some people have said yesterday that data, Neil, is from China, the data's from this, the data's from that. You know what? When I download the data from the United States, it's interesting. The historical data has been overwritten, and my numbers have off. And let's say what I thought, I just need to download the next 3 days of data because I haven't downloaded it for 3 days. I'm just going to download 3 days data. It actually looks at it. I look at it, and I can't find that data anymore. So basically, historically, U.S. has even changed their historical data. So who's accurate, who's not, what's accurate, what's not. I can't say. I'm just going to trust the data I receive. So as to look at data as just numerical data instead of political content and digesting it from a political perspective. Aside from that, I'm also pulling up days per doubling. So if I look at Canadian days per doubling, and remember each day, the number of days it takes to reach the next doubling. So you can see here we put a stomp on this right away from 0, and then the next doubling here, you can see we were 7.5 days, quite large. And the larger that number is, the better it is. The smaller it is, the smaller it gets, the worse we are doing. And you can see here we jump doublings really rapidly, and then on that time frame is shrunk in here, and we're jumping doublings really rapidly and approaching these higher doublings. And now we're in the 16th doubling. And yes, it's taking longer, but 16th to 17th doubling does take some time to reach. Nevertheless, in terms of days per doubling, pardon me, Canada is sitting at around 8 days per doubling, 8 to 9 days per doubling. Not bad, pretty good actually, but not awesome. So since we're here, let's look at Germany and their days per doubling. Their doing seems to be really good. And let us look at another view here, just for the sake of looking at the deltas. And I'm going to pick on one of these countries here because My point was to show you some of the Middle Eastern countries here. Let's pick on Iran. So you can see just by looking at this data, you can tell that it seems to be either they're widely collecting and testing, or they went through second wave. And Iran's case is unique, from what I understand. They wanted to have their democratic elections, and so they didn't shut down any borders. They didn't shut down any flights, and they held their democratic elections in their nation. And as Middle Easterns do, they hug and they kiss. And after the ministers got their positions, they all met as an ministerial meeting, and a bunch of them got sick. A large number of officials passed away, and as did public. And what happened out of that is public fled the major city centers like Tehran, where there's good coverage of hospital services, and they left to other parts in the regions where there is less services for hospital. Much like in Canada and the US or in Europe, you're not going to get a good hospital coverage in smaller towns compared to what is available in larger city centers that just get overwhelmed. So that's essentially what I understand has happened in Iran. And it was harder to control, and obviously leaders were passing away too. So it's a complex matter. On top of that, how do you handle it? But obviously, you can see here there seems to be another rise here to over 35,000 cases per day. That's a big number here, and we're still in the 2,000 cases per day. So Iran shouldn't really consider opening. Let's pick on staying in the Middle Eastern region here. Pakistan here. Pakistan's growing quite rapidly here, so Pakistan shouldn't consider opening, even though Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan has decided to keep the country open and allowing people to travel there in hopes to earn some money through tourism. Clearly, I don't think that's a brilliant plan. And if you're intending on traveling there, be very careful on your travels, and you're likely to be quarantined when you return. Please, I hope our nations do that. India, similarly, rising up. India did a pretty good job. You can tell by the data set as it's slowly growing, but then it just rose really rapidly. That's hard to manage that in a over 1 billion people. I think it's 1.2 now. I could be wrong. Nevertheless, it's difficult to manage that growth. It's going to get out of hand, unfortunately. Let us a few weeks ago, 4 or 5 weeks ago, I was writing and saying I feel like Russia, Peru, and Brazil were rising up really rapidly. They were quite low on the scale, but I felt like they were untouched for the longest time, and all of a sudden, I feel like they're just going to blow up, and they have. You can see the Russia has jumped up quite heavily into May, and then somewhat dropping here in Delta cases, daily Delta cases. But let us pick up Peru, and Peru is on what seems to be a rise, and maybe this drop, but I mean daily drops. It's all depending on how many they're getting counted and what's going on. And it's 2 weeks before, up to 2 weeks, let's say roughly before incubation period. Then you get tested. It takes a few more days to get tested, and the results come back. Depending on the type of test you're doing, an RNA test, or sort of like a blood test versus a swab test, and how quickly they come back, and whether you're existing case actively ill, or that you had it. So if I pick on, I think we said Brazil earlier. Yep, Brazil is still rising. I can see this crystal clear, and on the deltas, and it's neat to see. So again, and this is kind of how I'm looking at things, just purely numerically. And if I look at Brazil's days per doubling, it's not a long set of days here per doubling, and I can see that just by looking at the numbers. I don't need to look at it graphically. Again, it's just the way I can digest it, or I know the data because it's my data that I've assembled here. And I comparatively can say, how's Canada doing in comparison? Canada being in the blue here and Brazil being in the red on this chart. Our days per doubling are greater, and that's a good news because we want to have a large number of days per doubling. You don't want to have small number of days. That means you're doubling at a rapid rate, and that's not good. Okay, so there you go. That about summarizes this content on the COVID cases. But what I want to show you even more out of that is I also started to grab some data from the U.S. unemployment data. And if I'm going to show you this here, just basically I grabbed 2 sources here, and I'm going to pull that up for you guys really quick, if you don't mind, and pull this up for you and share the content of my browser. to give you an indication of where this source of data, where I source this data. So you can grab this over here. If I just go back, you can select the year to begin and the year to end, and you can see weekly unemployment claim data. It comes out every Thursday publicly for you to digest and download. So this over here is up to May 16th, but in order to get the most current data up to June, which is this last Thursday, mid-June here, June 11th, you have to look at this press release here, or news release here from Department of Labor. And you see the seasonally adjusted data, and then you see the unadjusted or non-seasonally adjusted data, NSA and SA inversely. So you see these tables here. So that gives you an indication of where I'm capturing this data. I'm going to switch back to my content here, if you don't mind. Just give me a second, and I'll switch back to my spreadsheet data here, and hopefully give you a view of what's going on. So January, February, you expect people to start getting laid off in January, into January, and possibly into February, even from the Christmas crush that's happening in January and February. Similarly, in the hospitality to retail to automotive markets, people are losing their jobs. Normally happens, and then it tends to pick up again in March. Hopefully picks up again in March, and especially in the U.S. And what we see here is that it seems like it's in the 200,000s number of cases. You know, on average, seems pretty standard. There's not drastically increasing or shrinking in large numbers until we hit mid-March, and it's 282. So what I did is I took this 211,000 cases, and you can see they're rounded to the nearest thou for seasonally adjusted versus, pardon me, seasonally adjusted data here versus, let me use my keyboard, non-seasonally adjusted data. And in here, you can see it's more accurate data. So what I took in what seems to be more accurate, I just worked with the seasonally adjusted data, and you see 200,000 being my baseline at 0 doublings, 422,000 being the first doubling, and so on and so forth, up to, you know, there's no way that 400 million people are going to get laid off, because the US doesn't have 400 million people. But just to give you an indication, I kind of did these doublings, and you know, realistically, it's only going to, worst case, I mean, a working public versus children as well, it'll probably only get to the 9th or 8th or 9th doubling, and how many people are truly employed versus unemployed to begin with, or students, and so on and so forth. So if I look at this this number here at 282, it got past the first doubling quite rapidly, because the cumulative here is what we're looking at, so much like we did with the COVID cases. And 493, boom, we hit the next doubling, and then 3.8 million, we jumped to the 4th doubling, 10.6 million, 5th, and then we stayed in the 6th doubling here of the number of cases that of unemployment cases that have been filed, and people have now, this is not accounting for people who may have taken another job, a part-time job or a couple of part-time jobs, and gone back to work. It's very difficult to gauge if a person got gainful employment to survive, or if they just got a job. And because of that, I'm not tracking those people who have been reemployed. And so when you look at the data online, you'll see about, they're sitting in the 20 million cases that they're estimating that are truly unemployed, but that's also not showing, because there's a coverage period of unemployment coverage, and when you no longer receive it, you get dropped off the radar and you're no longer tracked. So unemployment data has always been difficult to digest when it comes to economic data for a nation. And so I'm aware of that. And so I'm just trying to say, hey, it's interesting to note how many people have been laid off. Yes, is it possible that somebody might have been hired and then laid off again? We got double counting. Yeah, it's possible. But at the same time, we're also not counting so many people. So I'm going to leave that as a statistical anomaly, and then we're just going to work with that as an expected norm. So right now we're sitting at a good 44.7 million people roughly that have been cumulatively just laid off and lost their jobs. So let's, we were talking about this, let's say there's a good 330 million people in the United States. And not to say everyone has a family, but let's say, if we could say that there's, single parents and couples and children and non-children and grandparents and so on and so forth. But let's say an average of 3 people in a household and 4 people in a household. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm just going to do this as an example here. So we're going to just take this value here and divide it by 3. And take this value here and divide it by 4, and you got 82 million people. And in this case here, there's likely potentially 1 or 2 workers in the home if there's 4 people, and here as well 1 or 2, but let's just assume it's 1 for this case here. So if I were to divide this value by 2, we're sitting at about divided by 2, we're sitting at about 55 million. And if I took this value here and divided it by 2, we're saying worker public, this divided by 3, because we're gonna say 1/3 is working here, whereas half is working there. Geez, I'm trying to get this done while I talk, and I'm not doing a good job. 3, there we go. So we're at 36 and 2/3 million people that are employed in this case here, and 41 million people. So clearly the demographic is greater. We might have some groups of people where people are working greater, in greater quantities, in the sense that there's more than 1 worker in the home, or per residence. You might be having, groups of people living together as well, or spouses, both the spouses working instead of one, as in certain assumptions here that I've made. But just to give you an indication, we're reaching what might be a capacity here between these 2 cases. It's a kind of an interesting thought. I mean, maybe we are, maybe we aren't. I'm not very vividly familiar with US data, but just to give you an indication of something that's very interesting. So what we're seeing here is the number of cases of unemployment requests are coming through are diminishing, and that's a good sign. But what we saw earlier with respect to the plots, should the United States open right now, let's not look at days per doubling. Let's look at the deltas really quick. And if we pull up the United States and Delta, we're still seeing a good 20,000 cases per day. So when I compare that with, let's say, even Germany or Germany is a good one to compare, because I still think they're in the hundreds, a few hundreds, like 400s or something like that. But just to compare, I'm not sure where these numbers are. In the deltas per day, maybe let me just see here if I can get rid of the United States so I can actually see this in a reasonable view. Oh yeah, they've approached a negative value there because they're delta, but they're in the 300s and so on and so forth up here. So they're still kind of coming down here, and they're coming down, but they're not really plateaued, much like New Zealand was. So I don't think it's wise that the United States go out and say, hey, let's open up for business, but that's my interpretation. Similarly, if I were to say, let me just throw US down here and say Canada. Canada too has these unemployment values that I haven't been vividly tracking, just out of interest, because US numbers are just so huge, they're so neat to look at. Although Canada looks like they're nothing in comparison to US, just because of the sheer volume of data. The number headcount of data. If I just delete the US data and just look at Canada as it is, we saw this earlier, we're still in the 400s. And as that, I also don't believe that Canada should just widely open the doors, floodgates, and travel and whatnot either. So there you go. There you have it. There's my data in a nutshell. I'm going to share one more thing with you guys to give you an indication of where you can see some of the stuff that I've been writing online. And so go back to the browser view here, and I've tossed some stuff on Facebook. Let me see here on COVID data that I've been reading some papers here. This is really cool. It shows that the virus itself has mutated what seems to be 14 times, and by region here. So this was really cool data, and I've tried to reference everything I can. See, on this day here, I was describing on May 4th that Canada has breached its 16th doubling. Now, some of my posts are pretty long, and if you don't like to read, totally understand. I'll be sharing this on video just for those cases. Now, again, video. This case one's long, but hopefully the next ones are going to be shorter. And you can see here, I did a top 12, just who's on the top and where things are going. This is where I was saying that Brazil and Russia are rising up, although still low cases in per capita, but it still was rising. And these are deaths that I was anyway. Yeah, so very cool, and thank you very much. Hopefully this was useful to you, and if you feel like you want to see some other nations' data and pull it together, feel free to download it yourself. I can share some content of my formulas with you, or flip it to me what you want to see, and I will toss it together and maybe do a little video just for you if you need to, or review it with you personally, online, of course. Anyway, I'll sign off from now, for now, and hopefully I didn't waste too much of your time and this was useful to you. Cheers.